What's up, guys? This is Nick from Arch City Poker, and in today's video, I'm going to be continuing the poker hand review series with today's hand covering a topic that I will title as 3-bet bluffing the river. So a lot of my vlogs and videos recently have been pretty basic stuff, I would say. There is some more intermediate and a little bit of advanced concepts in some of the videos I've put out in the last month, but I think for some of you guys who are hopefully improving, for some of you that subscribe to my channel, they're looking for more advanced stuff. If a lot of the vlogs I put out are just more reminders or concepts that you guys already understand on a pretty darn good level, I would like to have some really interesting hands and some more advanced stuff for you guys. And it's good for you guys that are a little more novice and are trying to just become more fundamentally sound to see a hand like this where there's a lot of advanced stuff going on, because then it shows you down the road what you're working towards and what kind of player you can become, what your thought process should be during the hand at some point down the road when you have put together a lot of the simple building blocks and have started to really build your game up from the ground up very fundamentally and very, I guess, in a very sound fundamental way is what I was trying to say before I butchered that. So without further ado, let's get into the hand. I'll show you guys the spot and show you in card runners how profitable of a play that this 3-bet bluff on the river was. So my opponent, I didn't label him, but I would consider him a decent thinking opponent. This was actually the first session I've ever played with him, but I played with him for about 4 hours, and just by watching him play and hearing him speak, I think he was definitely a thinking player. Skill level wise, I'm not so sure about that. I think certainly 1 4-hour live session with a player is not even close to enough time to really understand what kind of player they are skill-wise. But I could definitely tell that he's not so ABC, and that I think that he thinks about the game on a little bit more of an advanced level. So when I tell you guys to often take lines and decide on your actions based on what the average player from your player pool would do, that goes for a player, for more of an unknown player. But if you have a read and you know how to exploit this player and possibly adjust, then you need to make that adjustment and be able to basically exploit them and make the most profitable plays that way. So let's get into the hand. He decides to open from 3x on the button. This is a live 2-5 game. I flat in the big blind with ace-jack offsuit. You could certainly consider a 3-bet, but I decide to flat. I like having this combo for some board coverage. Flop comes queen 8 deuce with 2 spades and a club, checks through, and a jack of spades on the turn. So before I get into the turn action, I want to go back to the flop where he checks behind here. Most opponents, from my experience and what I can tell, especially in live low stakes games, is that they over c-bet this kind of flop texture on the button. Their range is still going to be really wide here. I think the hands that are included in their range of, I guess, hands that are over c-betting are going to be almost all their flush draws, almost all their queen x plus. So when he checks back the flop here and the jack of spades comes on the turn, I think this really denies him a lot of nuttish hands. I think it caps him somewhat. I think that in poker there's usually no absolutes. So I think that he could sometimes have flushes, like rarely, and I think he rarely has 10-9 for like a straight. Rarely has queen jack for something like 2 pair, but I think he's very capped now. And so I decided to go for a lead with my combo. I think this is almost always effectively the nuts. I think I can get at least 1 street of value out of him here. And depending on the river and the player, I think you can often even go for 2 streets. So I lead for 25 into 32, and he decides to call. I think sizing, this is about as high as I would want to go a lot of times with this combo, just because around pot, I'd like to be a little more polarized to maybe something like, queen jack plus, but that's kind of up for debate. But I think this sizing's fine, especially because I think that this is possibly the best hand most of the time anyway. He decides to flat, and that's kind of interesting. I think that it could often be a hand like a pocket pair plus spades. It could be pair plus gut shot. It could be spades plus gut shot, but I think that, like I said, rarely will he show up with flushes now on the river, and I think that he rarely has straights. So I think that on this specific river card, which is a very interesting one, I think I can definitely go for value again and get worse hands to call. I decided to lead for 60 into 82. And you have to have a plan in the spot for what you're going to do if you're raised. And with most opponents, most average opponents in a live 2-5 pool, if they raise me here, I think this is a pretty easy bet fold. I think that it's quite hard for them to show up with a lot of bluffs. Most players in live low stakes do not bluff enough of the time anyway. So I think it's a pretty easy spot for a bet fold. However, with this thinking opponent, I think that he is capable of pulling off a lighter value raise or possibly a bluff. The issue with considering his bluffs is that I block a lot of what he would be bluffing with just the naked ace of spades. I do think he could take this line, though, with something like 10-9, or he could possibly show up with a hand like king 10 with the king of spades, so he has like king 10 offsuit. So I think that's certainly possible. And if we have come up with the conclusion that he should not have a whole lot of bluffs, as I strongly block his bluffing range with this card, then I think calling is not profitable. I think it's actually for sure losing money to even this type of player in this player pool. So I think a lot of opponents would think to themselves they'd have a tough decision between calling and folding. And I think you would see a lot of calling and a lot of folding mixed in from all kinds of different opponents. However, I think that a very, very small percentage of the pool, and honestly, maybe even like none of the pool, unless you have like a very good player or a pro, would consider a raise in this spot with this hand. I think a lot of players that understand the game on, let's say like an intermediate to a semi-advanced level, would say, well, I think I have decent showdown value. I kind of block his flush, which is true. But because you block that, you also block his bluffs, like I said, with this specific card. So I think a lot of players would struggle with the fact that they have some showdown value and that they think their hand is too strong to fold. Most players in live low stakes games, and even online games for that matter, guys, I think that they don't consider turning made hands into bluffs as often as they should. I think against this type of player, I fold out his straights almost all the time on this run out. I think that because he doesn't know me that well, and he's just gonna go based on what an average 2-5 player would do in this pool and in this spot, I think this is almost always gonna be a raise for me. So I'll show you guys where he went and raised me to 160, and I decided to click it back to 385. I think this sizing's totally fine. It shows a ton of strength to begin with, so I don't think this raise needs to be all in or any more than this, to be honest. But like I was saying, to finish that thought up, I think that this almost is always the nuts. When you guys see 3-bets on the river in your live 1, 2, and 2-5 games, and honestly, even like in your 5-10 games, if you guys play in any of those, I think you guys will agree with me that this is almost always the nuts, or at least like it's always a flush, and it's never going to be anything different. And so I think that this makes this a very profitable spot because I don't think he has a lot of flushes as played, and I think his value raising range is purely straights. And I think because I fold most of that out, I think that all of a sudden a spot where players decide on calling sometimes, which is, I believe, not profitable, and then folding, I think that raising is a very profitable option. And this is a very advanced line of thinking with all the stuff that I have already mentioned in the video with blockers and turning a hand with showdown value into a bluff. This is a very advanced spot. And so my opponent ended up tank folding, and he did have 10-9 for the straight. And so I think it's a very interesting spot. I'm going to show you guys in card runners real quick what I came up with. But essentially, going back to the beginning real quick, you guys can see on this flop that I have him betting his top pair plus, at least 80% of the time. Flush draws 85% of the time. I think this is often even 100%. But like I said, I'm not going to just assume that he does everything 100% of the time. If he's a thinking player, at least a decent thinking player, then I do think this will be pretty correct. I think he's able to check some of these types of hands. But for the most part, I think that it denies him, for example, flushes, like I said, a lot of the time, as you guys can see. So on the turn, when he just calls me here, and I'll show you guys, you can see that he hardly ever should have flushes. 0.4 4% of the time, essentially, I believe that he has flushes in the spot. It looks like a lot of his possibly check back queen X hands, and then a straight just over a quarter of the time. So I think my read was pretty correct in this scenario. And I think that on the river, I was pretty correct to think that if I can get him to fold straights a lot of the time, it's going to be very profitable. So if you guys see here that his raising range, like I said, on the river is going to be some flushes very rarely, and then his straights. And then I have him bluffing about a third of his missed flush draws. And actually, even if I change that, guys, to where I think that's incorrect, I think it's going to be a third of his nut flush draws, which I obviously block, so it's not really going to matter. So it will be 0%, but I think that's about the only combo he may, in fact, try to bluff with. So I think he's just very value heavy in this spot with mostly straights. As you guys can see there on the percentage mode, he's got flushes about 1% of the time, and then straights basically like 98% of the time. And if I think I can fold those out most of the time, then I'm pretty much folding out his entire range. So you guys can see with a call on the river, it is losing about $100 in the spot. It is a very, very negative EV play, and I think a lot of players would make a crying call here. Obviously, folding is going to be EV of 0, but you obviously lose the hand and he scoops. So let's go ahead and see if I was right about the raise. I haven't looked at the raise node yet, but I'm assuming because I fold out most of his range probably that this is going to be very profitable. So I go ahead and raise the 385. We will say that he calls with, well, we're going to say his flushes 100% of the time. And he may even, you'll get some players that might even fold some flushes, but I think for the sake of this hand with this type of player, he shouldn't be folding any flushes. If he's a decent thinking player, that's going to be overfolding. So I'm going to have him calling with 100% of his flushes. With his straights, if I think he folds these probably close to, I don't know, even 80% of the time, which I think is pretty reasonable for my read on the situation. And if he folds the rest of his hands, obviously. Oh, that's not going to be correct. Let me see here. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. Yeah, so not calling 80% of the time with the straights. That's the opposite of what I meant. So, yeah, we're going to go with, so if I think he's folding 80% of the time, which I think is quite accurate, we will rerun this. And you guys can see that this is going to be very profitable. Instead of calling and pretty much almost always being wrong in this exact scenario and losing $100, instead of folding and just losing out on the pot, thinking a little bit harder and a little bit longer about this type of spot and understanding how his range is constructed up to this point to where he shouldn't have a lot of flushes, but it in fact looks like a raise fold spot with his straights, raising to fold out almost his entire range is going to be incredibly profitable. So I know this was a little bit more of an advanced spot, and I hope it was interesting and a spot that maybe if you guys get involved in a hand like this in the future, you can start to think about how their range is constructed from the flop on. And, you know, when you guys are doing hand reading and like hand analysis and such, it's really almost like putting together a puzzle. And you put together the pieces starting from pre-flop to the flop to the turn to the river, and you can really start to deduce what their range is a lot of times almost to the exact hand. And I knew that my opponent was very straight heavy in this spot and probably rarely had flushes. And so that's how I go about thinking about hands and how I analyze them. I think this is a cool spot, like I said. So if you guys have any questions about this hand, about anything I said, and if you have any comments about my line or something you would consider doing different, go ahead and definitely let me know. I would like to have some discussion on these hand reviews because I think they're really interesting. So until next time, this is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care.